Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Hydragons Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to another Archon's Archive. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our description of Chaos Worlds. Technically, this is a part 2, and I'm going to try and get through it as expeditiously as possible because the part 1 is 2.25 hours. So, a quick chapter rundown of what we'll be talking about. We'll be talking about types of Chaos Worlds. Now, what is a Chaos World? Technically, under the actual definition, it is any world that is majority ruled by chaos, be it the theology, be it individuals, etc. If the person at the head of the chain making the decisions for the planet is a chaotic worshipper, by any stretch of the definition, that is a Chaos World. There are 4 primary types that we will be examining in depth. Demon worlds, that is worlds deep within the warp themselves that the gods have created. Subsumed or princehood worlds, that is worlds that were once in real space and have been transited into the warp, either by a demon prince, by some great ritualistic fervor, or of course by being sucked in by any number of chaotic elements within real space, like the Eye of Terror, the Maelstrom, etc. Warp storms, particularly bad ones, can do it as well. Traditional worlds. This is planets where chaos has existed in perpetuity with very little influence from the outside world. These are often looked at as the feudal worlds of chaos, or the civilized worlds of chaos. They are in real space, and they rarely enter the warp whatsoever, except when there is ritualism or other chaotic things to be done. But traditional worlds are usually essentially vestiges of old night. They are planets that were colonized by humans before the Emperor ever came about, and they have been left behind by the rest of humanity, either too isolated or perhaps in such a faraway or backwards part of the galaxy that there was no point in colonizing it. And they have developed worship of chaos as is natural for their society. And finally, the one that we're all more familiar with, Captured Worlds. Captured Worlds are, again, exactly what they sound like, a planet that has been grabbed by chaotic forces. In this case, it doesn't really matter what type of chaotic forces have grabbed them. We're going to be talking about Imperial worlds that are simply under new management, as they say. So, the next thing that we're going to be talking about is the chaotic ecosystem. What do people need to survive as a baseline in 40k? How can chaos provide those things to them? Now, there's also going to be a section on sustainment and the logistics train. We're going to be talking about them for each type of world. Now, I'm not going to go super duper in depth with the massive economic structure that is some of these worlds. I'll just be giving you an example of how to get from A to B on a chaotic world, and how those resources, the basic ones, might be provided for the humans or the other mortals involved. The important part of that as well, especially for captured worlds, traditional worlds, and subsumed worlds, is hat switching. The idea that an Imperial then becomes a Chaos Worshipper, or is coerced in some way to teach Chaos Worshippers how to run things on their planet. For example, administratum drones or ecclesiarch priests who come to the ways of chaos through either coercion, coordination, or convincing, or straight up bribery, as often happens, and they've chosen to ply their trade in the hands of a chaotic government the same exact way that they did for the Imperium. Now, hat switching is going to be something that we pay more attention to when we do a generalized chaos logistics video. Now, I've done a minor one for the armies, but I will be doing a much more specific world-on-world chaos on chaos logistics video, and I'll be building upon concepts that I talk about in this video. Next, we'll be talking about some of the minor gods, Chaos Undivided, all that type of stuff, whether or not that makes a difference in all the worlds that we've described. Primary problems with Chaos Worlds, specifically transition state problems, timelines and bottlenecks that they face as opposed to regular Imperial worlds, infighting, and external-internal pressures. And then finally, we'll be taking a crack at just designing a Chaos World for fun, what you need to think about when you talk about your own Chaos World, and what you need to consider when you think about, primary production lines, or what you need to think about when you're talking about what is a good thematic feel for a Chaos World. So let's start off with the 2 Chaos Worlds that are in the warp: Demon Worlds and Subsumed or Princehood Worlds. Now, the first, of course, question with this, considering that a lot of these are Legion worlds, does it matter if there are Chaos Space Marines in charge? And secondary question, does it matter if the Demon Prince in charge of my Subsumed world or Princehood world was originally a Space Marine? I would argue absolutely not. The considerations, the control, the manipulation of the environment will be almost exactly the same. For example, Mendrengard with Perturabo, they likely have some degree of control over the planet's ecology, the same way that a demon prince would. Of course, we know that Magnus and Lorgar have direct control over their planet's ecology and sometimes even its geography to an extent. So I would argue marine or not marine, it doesn't matter whatsoever. Generally, I will be focusing upon worlds that lack marines. So places that have just a demon prince or have been created and then humans have been either spawned there, dumped there, or are being continually transported there to serve some will of the gods. The populations of these worlds range from low to medium. Now, when I talk about low in terms of worldly population, the low end is still in the upper hundreds of thousands. So we're not talking like 10, 30 guys here. We're talking in the upper hundreds of thousands. Up to medium, which is the millions to the tens of millions. Unfortunately, most of these worlds aren't going to get above the tens of millions unless they're receiving consistent supply of people from outside, or they are really well organized. Now, the initial question to that might be, what about Demon Forge worlds? What about places like Mendrengard? They must have a higher population. Well, here's the thing. If you're not necessarily using a breeding population, aka you don't need to have people, reproduce sexually in order to have more children to work in the factory, if you're doing it another way, say cloning, for example, demonic reproduction, which has been done. Demon Kulaba is a good example of how you can manipulate the natural human cycle of birth and rebirth, as it were. So if you're using one of those artificial methods, not only can you skip a good portion of adolescence for your average worker, if you grow them to a certain size in a vat, and then you produce them that way, or if you're straight up vat growing or vita womb growing a whole bunch of people, well, the population only needs to be as big as you need it to be. And that can fluctuate by, a couple 100,000 without much of a difference in your vita womb production. In addition, on most of these worlds, you don't need a huge population. A growing, healthy population is basically not a necessity, because most of these planets have a very specific job that they are supposed to do. Now, that's not to say that some of these worlds couldn't develop and couldn't self-spontaneously increase in number dramatically over time, but it is to say that many of them are not intended to do so, and others are strictly controlled in a way that prevents them from doing so. So, I put it at low to medium. You could certainly argue that some have a massive population, well over that, into the billions, but I would be concerned about exactly how you're maintaining that given the limitations. So, what do the transition states look like for these worlds? Well, there's two different sides to this. For the demon worlds, there's really a dependence here. If the world is created by a chaos god and then humans are created on it, like literally born out of their souls being enrobed in flesh and then put onto that planet as a worker, a servant, whatever, the transition state, the amount of time between it being one thing and now being a new chaos world, is basically zero. And also, if it's a planet like that, which is handmade by the gods generally, they will not need to be changing it all that often. They won't need to be modifying the ecology or modifying all of the geography and things like that. They will have set it up to achieve the goal that they wanted. And so the transition states are kept relatively small and relatively minimal, which is positive because transition states are not great. They're not very healthy for chaos. They tend to involve a lot of wanton slaughter and unfortunate loss of life. However, I say it's dependent because some worlds are not intended to be 100% hospitable. Now, while I think demon worlds as a whole are meant to serve a purpose, that purpose is not necessarily the betterment of the people on them. So you could certainly say that a planet that is intended to be, say, a farm of pestilence or a permanent pleasure palace of Slaaneish's most favored demonettes, that could result in a population having influxes or ebbs and flows in their population. For every couple decades of population growth and subsistence on a demon world, which we discussed in our last video, how exactly that's going to work, for every couple decades of that, you're going to have a couple of years of, hard labor, mass executions, torture parties, all that good stuff. So, it can depend whether it's an ebb or flow world or a consistent production world, and we'll talk about the differences between them later on. For the Prince worlds, however, you got some of the highest transition period. Not only do you have to bring your world into the warp, which in and of itself is a danger to basically everybody on that planet who isn't an active Chaos Worshipper, and a good number of the Chaos Worshippers as well. When a prince comes into his own, as it were, when he reaches ascension, it is very common practice for him to attempt to pull his world into the warp, to literally grow physically closer to the gods, and also usually to escape persecution as well. It's really easy to retreat into the warp and basically evade anyone who's trying to attack you. But that does mean that not only do you drop into the warp as possibly an unsuspecting civilian or cultist, which is going to have deleterious negative effects upon your lifestyle for the moment. There will be some development, as we talked about, the terraforming that comes along with chaotic worlds in the warp and their human populations. But demon princes are not the gods. Their wants, needs, and essentially goals are not fixed. They can change. And because the prince is in direct control of the world, a change in his mind can often mean a change in the ecosystem that keeps you alive. So the transitional state for a princehood world, for a subsumed world, can be dramatic, it can be erratic, and it can be inconsistent. You know, you can come across good, you can come across bad, but as a whole, it is generally going to be a high rate of transition, which means basically adapt or die a good portion of the time. Potential resources. Well, on the true demon worlds, it varies greatly. Again, you have ones at the absolute lowest, barren rocks that are just corrupt hellholes where humans have to dig into the earth to try and find grubs or pieces of wood that they can chew on or turn into calories in some way. And then you have the exact opposite, where you have forge worlds and fortress worlds that have permanent supplies of unnatural caloric intake, or impossible forests of great fruits that cause bounty and can be made into all types of different resources, or wildflowers that can be turned into cocaine. It's a whole mash bag with demon worlds. You never know what you're going to get, because the goal of that world and its ecosystem created to sustain human life, if it is created to sustain human life, which, again, if there's humans on the world, generally the goal is to sustain them so that they can do the job, because if demons were able to do it, why bring the humans there in the first place? We're in the warp, we have infinite power, why would we bother with the demons? So, they range dramatically. However, on princehood worlds, you have none of the downsides. You will rarely have a prince who wants to live on a barren, empty rock. And this is one of the major problems I have with people's understanding of prince worlds, specifically Slaaneshi worlds. There is this image of the palace, right? The beautiful pleasure dome, or the perfected section of the planet, and then the rest of it is just an absolute utter hellhole where everyone is suffering. I would like to point out that there's a demon prince here. There's no limit to what he can do, produce, change, or request of the environment on his world. Meaning that if he wanted to turn the entire place into one continental-sized palace, there'd be absolutely no problem with him doing so. And of course, the population that lives within said palace is going to be living it up about as well as anybody else is going to be able to. Which is to say, pretty darn well a majority of the time. Again, Slaaneshi good is very different from normal human being good, but good for them, good for them. So, in addition to that, subsumed worlds tend to bring actual civilization with them. Remember, these are usually once imperial or has-been imperial worlds that are being captured and forced into the warp. That means that all of those resources, factories, plants, people, animals, etc., have now been pulled into the warp. That's a lot more raw material, and more importantly, variety of material than you'll tend to get on a demon world. On a demon world, there's no need for anything that the gods didn't really want to put there. I mean, they're not micromanaging every tiny spore or every little demon, but they certainly aren't putting extraneous forests on a world unless they're needed. They aren't putting extraneous fortresses on a world. They aren't developing their entire own system and then changing it over into a demon world. They're poofing it from non-existence into existence. So in that case, in terms of real-world assets, the princehood worlds actually have a pretty decent advantage because they bring all the infrastructure of the Imperium with them. Now, that can vary based on what type of world it is. If you pull Necromunda into the warp, for example, probably not all that great, but if you pull an agri-world into the warp, or even a civilized world or a feral world into the warp, you could be getting a lot more bang for your buck when it comes to raw resources. Possible goals and purposes. Well, there's a couple of classic ones, and there's a couple of nuanced ones. The first one is forges. A lot of demon forges, hell forges, whatever you'd like to call them, either end up in real space and have so much warp corruption that they may as well be subsumed or demon worlds, or they genuinely sink into the warp or become warp worlds, demon worlds, or some of them can also be literally created as demon forge worlds. These do exist. We have examples of them from Khorne, obviously within his realm as well, and we'll talk about that in a second. But we also have examples like with the true demon fortress, Mendrengard, Sortiarius, technically, though I would call that a prince world, and then of course you also have places like Galmec. So, forges are a classic one. The warriors of chaos need armor, they need weapons, they need equipment. What is better than making a forge in real space that can be attacked and destroyed? Making one inside of the warp that has access to infinite resources, and the only downside being that you have to get used to living in the warp, which we've already talked about, and mankind is eminently capable of doing. Mills are another one. Mills are some of the most brutal ones, and they are very common demon worlds. Mills are intended to do a specific thing, oftentimes without any external influence. You have a process, say it is developing a plague. So Nurgle releases a relatively new strain of disease onto a planet. It sweeps through the population, they suffer, they die, they are reborn, they gain immunity, and Nurgle takes the new disease, releases it in real space. Boom, there you go, you've milled a new disease. The human population certainly suffers from this cycle, but they also benefit from it. Those people essentially have super immunity to everything. Almost every single disease known to mankind, these people are completely immune to, or they're benign carriers. Another possibility is that Nurgle keeps them as a living library, a codex, or an index of a sort. Now, of course, he has his Pax Fulcrum, but we all know that Isha cleanses herself of these diseases. That means that whatever test batch Nurgle had has to be held onto until Isha is done. So, perhaps he uses these guys as a library of Alexandria for all of his different plagues. And of course, if they suffer with them from that long, that must mean they have significant resistance to them. Again, super immunity being a standard trait for these types of worlds. It also means that if they are a benign carrier, coming across one of these individuals must be like, I don't know, standing in front of the elephant's foot. Not fun. Mills could also be referred to as ritualism mills. You could have a place like a Zechian planet that does nothing but produce psychically capable individuals, whether it be aspirants to go into the Chaos Legions to attempt to turn them into sorcerers, or whether it be psychers to be released into real space, essentially madmen to turn into bombs or ritual fodder. These are sustained by a human population, because of course you need humans and their innate spark, their souls, etc., in order to access psychic powers in the first place, and then you need to produce them and send them off-world. The planet itself may be completely unaware that this is their function. They merely exist and continue to produce and to follow along in these traditional lines, much like some traditional worlds that we're going to talk about. But these mills are essentially clean, almost uninterrupted biomes. They do a job, they have a very, very simple ecosystem designed to keep people alive long enough to do the task, and then have their next generation, again, long enough to do the task. Now, as miserable as that sounds, it's not as bad as it could be. At least you know that the goal is to keep you alive for as long as is needed to do the job, and that could be decades. Hell, considering how many Chaos Cultists are probably straight up immortal at this point due to Chaos corruption, it could be centuries, which could be positive or negative depending upon how you look for it. But for the mills that aren't permanently, snow globed, essentially, not closed ecosystems, those are long-term investment worlds. Now, long-term investment worlds, we're going to be talking about them in a bit, specifically with Khorne. This is a thing where a demon prince or a demon god, Khorne, Slaanesh, Nurgle, Zeech, etc., wants something out of a world but isn't sure exactly how to go about it. The idea is that, like an ant terrarium, you give a bunch of raw resources, you provide a bunch of things, but you don't know exactly what you're going to get out of it. Khorne's blood worlds are a good example of this. What does Khorne actually get out of something like Tuska and his guys killing a bunch of both each other and Khornate demons? Well, initially that world was owned by a demon prince. Khorne was displeased with them, so he sent the orcs to deal with them. As a result of this long-term investment of resuscitating the orcs every time they die, he's able to punish demons he doesn't like by keeping them on that world. A very effective long-term investment. Now, these long-term investment worlds can also function like mills, but with very, very long timelines. For example, I would certainly imagine that something like Greater Demons of Tzeentch need time to perfect their ritualism, and possibly to scry or look into the future, etc. If they want to do that in a way that is less obtrusive than going directly to Kairos, for example, to ask him to look into the Well of Eternity or whatever, go into a long-term investment world, grab a human population from a culter world, organize them to worship you as a Greater Demon of Tzeentch, give them the powers and the resources that they need on this world in order to learn how to scry into the future. Give it a couple centuries, and those industrious little humans have developed a vast lexicon of prophecies, walls and racks and stacks of scrolls of little scraps and pieces of the future. Now, is any of it actually helpful or effective? Maybe not, but even if it's 0.001% effective, and it only costs you a little bit of energy and a random world in the warp, of which there are plenty of blasted hellholes in the warp that nothing lives on, so certainly terraforming one isn't too much effort for a Greater Demon of Tzeentch, it's usually worth it, because hey, that's a resource that the other Greater Demons don't have. It could be a leg up. And then finally, afterlives. Now, I put afterlives in quotes because it's really for more stable worlds. And this applies more to princehood worlds than to demon worlds. Once a demon world has reached peak ecosystem, achieved its function, whether it's a mill, long-term investment, or a forge, yeah, it's gonna reach a peak and a point, and then it's kinda gonna fluctuate, hover around that area. Afterlives, on the other hand, are almost like a slice of life anime come to reality. And I do hate to use that phrase, but it's about the best way I can describe it. If a prince finds the perfect balance, I mean genuinely perfect death to birth ratio, perfect amount of worship to the gods ratio versus worship to himself, perfect amount of comfort for himself whenever he needs it, everything he could possibly need or think of to require, basically all needs met, perfect harmony, perfect homeostasis on his world, he'll never leave. The goal has been reached. The idea that you've become a demon prince, a god in the warp with control over something so infinitesimally managed and controlled, no matter how many millennia it's taken, in the warp of course, well, that's your Elysium. That's your eternity. You know, for the humans there, that's also Elysium. There's no getting out, there's no escaping, and once you've reached that level of harmony, that's about it. Your concerns or worries are pretty much cut off because your physical form and your society have caught up with the rate of change that princes often demand. You know, go through 3,000 generations of human beings breeding in the warp with a demon prince calling the shots, they're barely gonna be recognizable as humanoid anymore. And on a planet like this that's perfect for the demon prince, it's gonna be perfect for the humans as well. They're gonna be super well adapted, and their society is going to be developed around adapting to this planet. Now, again, that applies more to subsumed and prince worlds. Even if a planet, by the way, does not have a prince, this could still be the eventuality. You have a planet that has reached perfect homeostasis, perfect input-output, perfect reliability, perfect terraforming of both the planet and its population, and then if nothing else is touched, nothing else is messed with, nothing external comes to mess with them, they're gonna sit like that. Perfectly. No fluctuation, no difference in quota, no change in external pressure, just coast. Comfortably, and I would argue happily, for, again, millennia, or until somebody comes and stirs the hornet's nest. Examples of these, Mendringard is definitely a forge. It is definitely a demon world. You could argue it's a subsumed world. I would definitely call Mendringard a demon world. You get the demon forges, those of Khorne. Khorne's blood worlds are great examples of full-on demon worlds. Sortiarius, Galmec, again, we've already gone over those in the previous video and in this one. And then technically, this can also include the gods' realms themselves. So, if you've ever seen the classic map of the 4 Chaos Gods' realms cut up into 4 different sections, I went over it in my Warp video, that could technically count as one of these Chaos worlds. Are there humans who live that deep in the Warp? Questionable. Very, very questionable. That is a place that is very difficult to get to, even if you're a demon prince. Pure demons don't want to go there for lots of reasons. Of course, they have to restart their journey there, being regenerated and spawned to float back upwards towards reality, hopefully bunny hopping on planets, energy eddies, souls, etc. along the way. But humans that get down there are either invited or incredibly tough, or they got there by cheating, which can happen as well. Now, I'm not going to go into the book Godblight, because Godblight is a sin against Chaos as a lore and Nurgle as a god. There is no book that I dislike more than Godblight, because you literally defy all logic in existence to have a mortal break the Pax Fulcrum, and I'm not going to get into it because I will lose my actual mind screaming here at my computer. But an example of that, where someone has entered the actual realms of a Chaos God directly, you're going to have one of two things. Either you are protected in some way, and thus you are able to remain there for a short period of time, or possibly even extended period of time, or you are going to rapidly degenerate into a feature of the landscape, if you will. So, for example, if you end up in Nurgle's Garden by some unfortunate stretch of your bad imagination, you will mutate into a tree in a very short period of time, and then you will grow and produce more trees of the same kind, and those trees will be devoured and create more trees. If you end up going to Tzeentch, you could end up as a pillar of salt. Your entire body could be turned into lead. Your bloodstream could be replaced with diamonds. Your eyes could burst into flame along with your entire limbic system. You could mutate into 30 different types of animal and then explode like a thermonuclear warhead. There's essentially no limitations with Tzeentch. With Slaanesh, you will essentially break down and have an aneurysm as your entire sensory system, from every inch of skin to your nose, eyes, mouth, throat, ears, etc., bursts and your blood-brain barrier explodes with the sheer input of just being able to see the Prince's Palace from thousands of kilometers away. And then, of course, with Khorne, I would argue that it's very likely you would run into a mouth-frothing, screaming rage, and then proceed to run at the closest thing that you could try to beat to death, and it would probably beat you to death. That was what I would say, but technically, the Gods' Realms can be traversed. I just wouldn't recommend it. So let's move on to our less esoteric planets, shall we? More traditional Chaos worlds, quite literally in this case, with traditional worlds and captured worlds. With traditional worlds, these Chaos feral worlds, or feudal worlds, or even civilized worlds at their most advanced format, you will have a medium population. Again, in the tens to the hundreds of millions. If you peek into the billion area, that is a bit of a rarity, and you might be reaching the end of your time as a self-contained snow globe world. You might be about to break into the stars once you reach that billion point, because a lot of these traditional worlds lack resources. A lot of resources, which is usually why the Imperium hasn't bothered to actually colonize them yet. Captured worlds, on the other hand, they can range between medium and high. Oftentimes you will notice that Chaos worshippers tend to go after planets with smaller populations. Why? Because it's a lot easier to take over a planet with 50 million people on it than it is to take over a planet with 2 billion people on it. It's also easier to knock out a PDF that has 40,000 troops as opposed to a PDF that has 5 million troops. So, just in terms of logistics, lots of captured worlds tend to be medium, or if you are a legit cult and you are pretty significant in size and you are able to defeat a larger world, or you're able to do an uprising on one of your own worlds, such as a hive world, then you can find yourself in control of a high population world in the billions, which is wonderful. Even after a civil war, many of these places will still have populations in the billions. So very, very useful for Chaos to have that many people that they can put to work. The transitional states. Well, for the traditional worlds, it's going to be minimal. Essentially, the only thing that's a transition state for traditional worlds is the symbolic shifting of power from the egalitarian might makes right mindset to the reorganized mindset. The best example of this is Gura, the idea that before Nadzybar and the Gower came to power with the Blood Pact as their militarized priesthood, there were dozens, hundreds, thousands of different tribes of tribal barbarians and Gurin savages who were beating each other to death over water rights and iron armor and fortresses out in the deserts of Gura under the red sun for, 25,000 years or so. And that society, as degenerate as it was still a chaos society. Organized, cultivated, and with its own ecosystem. But that doesn't mean that after the Blood Pact and the Archon take over Gura, unifying the tribes, or more accurately, destroying those who would not unify, then you have a symbolic change in the government. No longer is whatever the strongest says goes. Now there is actual rule and organization and orders that come down from above. Resist them and be slain. Obey them, prosper. Human beings, even if chaotic, or I would argue especially if chaotic, and then even if feral or very, very simple in terms of their society, can understand the concept of centralized power. And generally, it will offer them significant benefits. Again, a unified society, everyone pulling in the same direction, more often than not makes more progress than every single crackpot warlord trying to set up his own independent micronation. However, for the captured worlds, it's short, but it's relatively brutal. You either have a takeover mentality or a convert mentality. Generally, the takeover mentality is from external forces, the convert mentality is from internal forces. If you have an internal force where everybody is from the same planet, and they all know the local population, you know your neighbors, you know your friends, you know the people in charge of government, the people in charge of the food kitchens, etc., and your cult has managed to seize power, well, why be brutal with those people? You know them. They're your neighbors. If you can be convinced of the glory of your cult's cause, certainly not only can they, but they should. That's very, very simplistic logic. I severely doubt anyone would disagree with that. As much as you might argue imperial bias certainly could prevent even friendly neighbors from getting along with one another, if the alternative is the brutal crackdown that often comes as a result of capturing worlds, oftentimes a local neighborhood cult will choose to work with the population rather than exterminate or waste the population. The takeover mentality is often vicious, brutal, and hopefully, mercifully, short. Now, outside of external pressures, if a cult or a warband or any Marines or whatever take over a planet, they are aiming to behead the leadership, remove the defensive structure, and then as quickly as possible, run it for all of its resources, or set up a defensible position. If you are a Chaos Warband or a Chaos Cult looking for a new homeworld, you need to be worried about external pressures, but we will talk about that in a minute. Short is to say, for transition states, that period of time where Chaos will struggle and will have a hard time unifying and things get real ugly, it's minimal for traditional worlds because it's just a symbolic transfer of power to the dominant tribe. But for the captured worlds, it is also short, but it is also relatively hardcore. It is brutal. It is hard-edged. There's no time for this. We cannot discuss things if you're not going to come to the light willingly. We're going to have to do it now by force. Potential resources. One of the primary ones is the natural resources, especially for traditional worlds. They don't have much else. Many of them don't even have industry yet, technically. So plenty of them will be relying on mines. They'll be relying on orchards. They'll be relying on classic agricultural style infrastructure. And of course, they could be working with all different types of technology as a result of that. That could be black powder, that could be auto guns, it could be bolt-action rifles, it could also be bludgeoning each other to death with clubs. But to be clear, the utilization of natural resources does not necessarily make a planet inherently inferior. Sure, I don't expect a planet that has not invented the wheel yet, or written language, to be able to develop spaceflight. But you want to know what they can develop with enough centralization and organization? Ritualism. And that can often contact the people who do have spaceflight. And those people, if they are chaotically aligned, well, they can be quite a help to a planet that has lots of people, lots of natural resources, but needs technology. Secondarily, and this is specific for captured worlds, which is why I didn't write it down, you will have the infrastructure of the Imperium. You will have the natural resources, be it human beings, be it labor pool, or be it the actual physical hard assets of something like a hive, a forge, a civilized world, and all of its factories and field systems. All of those now belong to you. These are natural resources that you've essentially stolen from the original planet. The goals and purposes of traditional and captured worlds are really self-explanatory. You have repurposed worlds, a planet that is like a hive world. Originally, they produced cars and pieces of spaceship. Now they still produce pieces of spaceship, but instead of cars, they produce armored cars, and they've stolen all the PDF rifles and they're using them to make light mechanized units to help defend the planet. Repurposed is simple enough. Repurposed agri-worlds, for example, are basically not changing. The only thing that's changing is where the food is going. Instead of to the rest of the Imperium, now it is going to chaotic forces. New homeworlds. This is a primary thing for cults, which really never gets talked about, because space-bound and spacefaring cults really never receive the light of day from GW whatsoever. Once a cult is vanquished or they disappear off into the ether of the warp or into space, they kind of get written off. But what happens when one of those veteran cults, or a cult that manages to escape one world that wasn't hospitable to them and that they couldn't really take over by themselves, what happens when one of those cults finds a nice, juicy, vulnerable Imperial world to bed down on and make into a new homeworld? That's one of the best instances I have of how lots of feral worlds, and also feudal, and I would argue quite a few civilized worlds as well, would end up having large chaos cults in charge of them. For example, to give a very, very good example actually, if you had a cult of corn that developed on a hive world, and they couldn't take over the hive world, but they could take over the spaceport, right? They managed to charge with all their feudal weaponry and kill a bunch of people and grab a bunch of weapons and equipment and kidnap a bunch of slaves and herd them all onto a spaceship, and then they escaped and jumped into the warp, and oh boy, oh no, we're all about to starve to death. Crap, we gotta find a new homeworld, real quick. And so rather than trying to window shop around in the warp, something that they might not necessarily understand, they were literally had their uprising yesterday, so their knowledge of chaos might be pretty limited. Rather than try and chance it inside of the warp, they go and try and find another world that is easier to conquer. Let's say that they come across something like a civilized world. Well, sure, there's orbital weapons that, target their ship, and maybe they bring it down or they injure it, and yes, that ship's been knocked out. It's 500 clicks north of here. Go send my civilized PDF to go deal with them. Well, the civilized PDF might be a whole heck of a lot, orders of magnitude, less prepared to deal with a veteran, experienced, cornate cult, full of bloodlust and very, very hungry with no option other than fight it out of here, than an actual Hive Worlds PDF would be capable of. And so, every single force that the Chaos Cult manages to dispatch, whether it be little groups of PDF troops on a civilized world, or sections of defending troops on a hive world, they can steal their guns, they can steal their equipment, they can steal their knowledge, and they can gain experience by fighting them, becoming more talented warriors as time goes on. So, that's how you end up now with Cult from World A has traveled to World B, and because World B isn't as defended as World A, they've managed to set up their own new homeworld, and they can claim it for themselves as refugees, essentially. The next one is worlds that are being prepped for subsumption. This one's very simple. Like a Gehemenet Tower, or of course Sortiarius, some worlds are intentionally taken from being in real space to being in the warp. So, how does this process start? Usually, it starts with a cult. Now, there's some examples of, the word bearers. They have their intentional ritual to try and damn an entire world and send it into the warp. There's, of course, Magnus, who can pull entire worlds into the warp using grand rituals and great sorcery. But at the end of the day, it always comes down to a ritualist, a knife, a bunch of candles, and a really long time spent chanting and walking around before stabbing somebody in the chest. So, these prepping for subsumption plans are essentially, we're all trying to become demon princes. We all have a goal here. The goal is to essentially ascend to godhood. So, you're spending a lot of time in real space, on a captured world, or even on a traditional world, trying to achieve princehood. Trying to achieve that ultimate goal on your world so that you can bring it into the warp and become a new demon prince and back to the worlds that we just talked about. This can take decades, this could take centuries, to be entirely honest with you, because the process for becoming a demon prince is anything but standard. There is no reliable benchmark that I would say applies to all people. What makes a Marine a demon prince, what makes a Primarch a demon Primarch, and what makes a human a demon prince are probably so dramatically different that it would be almost impossible to clarify what exactly is required. So, another good one is they act as logistical support for larger forces. So, if you capture a world, or if you're a traditional world with a resource to sell, say for example food, a very traditional one is food, because of course food is on short supply on lots of worlds. So food is very important. So is raw materials if you're on a planet that has metal, or has water even, or lots of oxygen, or lots of grass, for example, and another planet doesn't have that, or needs it transplanted into the warp. Well, you could start threshing that stuff and shipping it off-world in exchange for the technology and the assistance that you need. Essentially, it works like a barter economy. I give you this, I receive this in turn, we both get what we need, we both improve our societies, the gods are glorified, happy days. Now, it can also apply with cults that are put in place to prepare a world for chaotic invasion. Again, the word bearers, classic here. They set up a cult on random world. They already know the playbook of how to set up seditious elements within Imperial society, and then by the time that they're mid-sway with the uprising, the word bearers sweep in, grab all the cultists, grab all the supplies they need, and they're out, bang, scot-free, no problems. They've just fleeced the Imperium at the cost of like 0 Marines and a couple thousand useless cultists that they weren't gonna use anyway. That's the negative side of it. There's also the support for larger forces in terms of the Sabbat Worlds Crusade. If you have a large human empire that worships chaos, you're going to need agri-worlds the same way that the Imperium needs agri-worlds. You're going to need Forge worlds the same way that the Imperium needs Forge worlds. And a lot of these planets that were originally producing civilian goods, again back to our cars to armored cars example, whatever they were producing, we're going to flip it around and turn it into a military good. If they were producing semi-automatic autoguns for PDFs around the subsector, cool, we're going to jury-rig those with some chaos scientists, maybe a demon tech priest. Now they're fully automatic, we're going to make them standard issue for all of our troops. Thank you very much. Or, even more extreme, your planet used to not be able to produce anything. It's a dead, empty rock where people just lived because it had chemical mines. Cool, that entire place is now going to be physically terraformed with chaos ritualism, and it's going to be a lot more producing because these crystals have started to grow on their own with Zechian power, massively increasing the amount of resources you have on the planet. Now, this is expensive and far more difficult than it is in the warp in comparison to outside the warp, but it is doable. Again, Garyon is our example here, where you take a little bit of resource and, using chaos ritualism, you make it an abundant resource and a very valuable one. Traditional uprising is a classic one. Now, a traditional uprising is essentially what I talked about. You don't like the government. You, seditious element, don't like the government. I'm not a big fan of the government. 30 on 30. But you don't like them. You think the planetary governor is a snob and a bastard, and you think that the imperial nobility are all incestuous demon scum, which, hell, they might be. I'm not even gonna lie, probably most of them are. But the Imperium doesn't want you to think that. That's bad thoughts. You shouldn't be thinking that. No, those are seditious ideas. Chop the hand off the person who says that to you, but dealing with them, getting rid of the upper class of society, yay, good for you, you might not have thought about how to actually set up society afterward. And now that's a you problem. That's on you. You got rid of the ruling oligarchy, you are now the rulers. Figure it out. A lot of the time, that's how it shakes down. Finally, you get organized traditional society. Very similar again to Gura. If you don't have space travel and you're not likely to get it anytime soon, well, you may as well try and develop as a society. Mankind always seeks towards progress, especially when there's no external pressure forcing us down to an animalistic level like there is on some demon worlds or possibly even some princehood worlds. Without those pressures on our upward mobility and our technological development, you could end up with a Tiska. You could end up with a psychic society. You could end up with a place where mutants are the base species and everyone lives in happy-go-lucky harmony. Now, is that likely to occur? Probably not, but it is absolutely possible, and arguably it's most likely on traditional worlds because they are untouched. They are pure, and they rarely have contact with either outsiders who could upset their views and their very very traditional society. But you also have the problem of, well, if they don't have the technology to leave, they're probably not going to develop it for a while. So those traditional societies will develop internally. They will grow more and more capable until eventually being able to develop things that will get them out of their current situation. Examples of this, classic ones, Gura, Garyon, Cultus originally, Cadia originally, Silent Forge, possibly, that might be one that's still in real space, we're not exactly 100% sure. Real space Heretic Forges are a classic one, and then the really legacy XXX Rebel Legacy World. So, Planet rebels, the Imperium loses, they put it under permanent blockade, they pretend it doesn't exist, they scrub it from Imperial records, they destroy any ability for anyone to go there and set up, orbital beacons and stuff to prevent you from going there, and then they just kind of leave it hoping that everyone will starve to death. Those Rebel worlds, they're gonna end up as traditional worlds eventually. It's gonna take time, but it will happen. They start off as captured worlds. Once they're not touched for a couple of millennia, you can call them traditional worlds at that point. They do have a bit of a head start. So, what is the chaotic ecosystem? What is this thing that I talk about when I say that they can provide for themselves? Well, what do people need to live in baseline 40k? Water, a certain amount of it per day. Doesn't have to be clean, doesn't have to be pure, doesn't have to be tasty, but they need some amount of water. Power. You need some source of power. Now, this can be direct warp energy. I'm not even kidding. You could straight up fill a generator with demon juice from the warp, siphoned directly, and you can produce power. You can also have arcane or psionic implements that produce electricity. Again, electricity, steam power, locomotion, whatever you need. It can be provided by warp power if you can't just provide it traditionally with good old-fashioned gas, nuclear, thermal, etc. Around 1,800 calories a day. I put around because it can vary quite a lot, but mostly in the downward direction instead of the upward direction. And then 80% daily value of what I call your base essentials. Now, your base essentials are essentially if your doctor's ever told you you have a deficiency in X or Y, be it iron, selenium, nitrogen, whatever, those are things that you need more of as like a base macro or micronutrient. Arguably, because of how the Imperium is and how humans in the Imperium are able to live both closer to each other and on less foodstuffs on an individual per-person basis, it seems likely to me that these daily requirements for a human in our reality have decreased by roughly 20%. Because without them, it would be really hard to justify that these are humans at all if you needed no micronutrients or no macronutrients to stay alive. If you could just live on carbs alone, that's no longer really a logical human being. But if you're talking about just a significant decrease in the amount of DV items you need, again, talking like iron, selenium, all that type of macro micronutrients, that's a little bit more believable because the Imperium, and Chaos is an extension of that, likes to fortify and enrich food with the bare minimum essentials that need to keep you alive, keep your blood healthy, keep your brain functioning, all that stuff. Now, do they care if there's a flaw in that system or if you haven't received your daily value of stuff in a while? Probably not. I mean, it's going to be a note of public health if it's happening to everyone. Like I talked about in my food video, if everyone is getting scurvy, we're probably going to order some lemonade next time for a mass distribution campaign over the next couple of months, and then adjust whoever is producing the stuff to put more vitamin C on that shit. But still, you're gonna need to do that at some point in some way. 80% of your daily value is what I would generally say, putting it about 20% less mineral and calorie consumptive than the average human today. That also means that we need to put into place some concepts with this ecosystem. One, the work to live system. The work to live system is essentially grown out of many of the time pressures that chaos worlds have that regular worlds don't. If you choose to be idle on a chaos planet, you're not wasting your time. You're wasting the planet's time. There's a very solid chance that the society you live in, or the planet that you live on, is under imminent, active threat of invasion, or of some unbelievable level of violence, whether it be from the Imperium or the tribe next door. So that means that if you want mass dissemination of food, if you want provisions from the government, if you want somebody in charge to care about feeding you, you had better be at work. You had better be on the line. You had better be actively participating in the defense of your world. Now, even if you work as a sanitation worker, still counts. Still means that if you don't spend X amount of hours at work, you're just not going to get rations that day. And there are logistical systems set up in place in order to ensure that this happens. One of the primary ones is called the labor pool system. The labor pool system is very simple. If you are a person who regularly works at a specific place, after a certain period of time, once headcounts are taken and a consistent number of people working in each factory or labor pool is created. Now again, these labor pools can be Factory A, Factory B, Factory C, but they can also be by class or by type. If you're a menial labor person and you work as like a janitor or something, you could be in the menial labor pool system. If you are an industrial worker or a hab-fab worker, you could be in the hab-fab worker labor pool system. This essentially means that your name or some other physical description of you, your place in the line, whatever, is tallied, marked down. Hey, this person has shown up on time for work 30 days in a row over the last 40-day period. You know, we give you 10 days and then 1 day off, or 3 days and then 1 day off, or perhaps it's even no days off, but there's some amount of sleep time or leeway time. Again, I'll talk more specifically about how this labor system would actually shake down on different worlds in a future video, specifically going into the absolute nitty-gritty with cults. It's not the goal now. I'm just talking about the labor pool system. Then that means that you've achieved some level of specificity. You are now labeled in the chaos logistics system as an industrial worker, a forge worker, a hab worker, a menial worker. That means that they know, hey, this guy works in the menial fabs. If I want to check whether he's lying to me or not about getting food today, well, I can check with his boss or his overseer. Or if I really want to be a little more organized, I can take his name down and basically take attendance. And if I take attendance of that person's name and I mark it down and I hand that up to my higher-ups, well, they know to feed this guy today. Now, that's very similar to how the Imperium does it. It's just a little bit less coordinated because, well, it's the labor pool system. It's organized on like a check plus or check minus box. There's no difference for what day it is. There's no difference for even necessarily who you are. They don't really care. Are you a specialist? Are you talented? Are you replaceable? Who gives a shit? We don't know. This is still all flying by the seat of our pants, essentially, because we don't have the administratum to super hyper detail in on people's names, addresses, where they live, etc. But it does mean that there's a degree of flexibility within chaos society. If I don't show up at my workplace, but I show up at another workplace, or if my entire workplace gets pulled off of one project and switched to another project, unlike an Imperial who might have to go through a bunch of bureaucracy, changing my labor task, changing my level of tithe, changing where I live, switching up my living accommodations, none of that shit with chaos. It's just, oh, you were a hab worker yesterday and you're a field worker today? Cool, here's your field worker's rations. Keep showing up. We just want you there working. We don't care about what you were doing before, how well you do it. Now, the irony here is this is actually a very like Maoist system. So back in the day with the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, the idea was, hey, if we can just put people in the fields into work in the cities, our society will progress. Turns out you still need people in the fields. It's not exactly how Chaos does it, but it's a very similar mentality of like, you're a person, you're a worker. You have value in so much that you are a person who can work. I don't care what special skills you have or abilities you have. If you can do that in your current job, cool. If you can't, tough titty, you're gonna have to deal with it. This results in some inefficiencies that we're gonna go into later. The loose and tight times. So, loose times in Chaos Society versus tight times, specifically in the command structure. Loose times are where there's less centralized command. For the overall planet, loose times are arguably the best. Now, for the individual person, it might not be incredible, because loose times basically indicate that overall control of the planet isn't really set. Nobody's truly in charge at this moment. It's one of the big times that you see during transition periods. Now, loose times also mean that nobody's beating down on you to meet quotas. Yeah, you still work to live, you still get paid, but there's more leniency because nobody's cracking the whip over your back. Nobody's coming to kill us right now. There's no concern about any of this stuff. We've just been updated and modified in some way. This oftentimes happens with a planet that has betrayed the Imperium, but it hasn't really gotten out to the Imperium yet. Basically, a Chaos Demagogue is in charge, reorganizing society at will, tossing up a bunch of labor pools and saying, let's see where the chips lie, see how this goes, toss in that concept, switch the lines over to this production, I guess we making machine guns now, that kind of stuff. Loose times mean nobody's beating down your door about missing work one day. Nobody's really being too tight-fisted with the food right now because, well, we're not under siege, and we're not likely to be under siege for a while. Hell, the Imperium might still be delivering our cult food on a regular basis. You know, if the Demagogue is a smart one and hasn't turned himself over or shown that he's chaotic and managed to take control quietly. Well, my goodness, you're in good hands, right? You're no longer having to deal with the bullshit of imperial bureaucracy and, of course, the more deeply ingrained imperial religion, which would go against your new faith. But on top of that, there's no external pressure at the moment. The only problem is keeping yourself fed and encouraging and increasing your position in this new hierarchy that Chaos develops, which we already went over in the last video. Tight times are worse. Specifically, they're worse for the planet. With these laissez-faire labor systems, especially on traditional worlds, but these can also apply to all other types of worlds in this ecosystem, this is when the external or the internal pressure gets on high. So, for example, if you're on a captured Forge world or a Demon Forge world, and all of a sudden the people in charge are like, oh crap, we've been eating through reserve food at a dramatic rate, and that whole 10-year timeline we had for the time that we needed in order to develop our own food production, that's shot, and we have about 6 months before everybody starts to starve. That can't happen. All right, tighten the belts, everybody. Half rations. On top of half rations, we're switching over production lines. On top of switching over production lines, we're trying to achieve the impossible, aka chaos corruption, attempted rituals to try and grow more useful crops. And of course the classic one, hey, everybody who dies on the line or any injury that severs a limb, you're tossing in every body part and we're going to be turning that into emergency relief rations. Yes, this is corpse starch time. Tight times are tight for everybody. It's bad for the leadership because, oh boy, does this require a lot of oppression to actually carry out. If you want to turn a Forge world into a world that can sustain itself with nutrient gruel and algae, that takes a lot of water, that takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of minding, tending, and a lot of minute and very, very difficult scientific horticulturalist control of agriculture. So you need to be constantly hyper-focused on primary thing while you're now also worrying about, we might be drawing attention here with all this oppression and all this violence, and if the Imperium wasn't coming to deal with us before, there's a good chance that they might now. This is the time where you have things like the Siege of Rex, where they switch over the labor auxilia into a military group so that they can enforce new labor laws and things like that. The labor pool system is going to be broken down. You're going to have more and more groups doing smaller and smaller tasks. Many, many hands making light work. Finally, another important set of rules: law, land, labor, capital. So for law, Chaos almost always has a set of laws, but much like the Imperium, it's all about enforcement. During loose times, it's quite possible that laws are just going to not be enforced. Now, absolute anarchy and violence is usually not going to be allowed, at least not on a large scale, but when it comes to tight times, every crumb counts, and every bit of malfeasance or sedition is often paid with from violence. Labor, of course, we've already talked about with the ideas of work to live and the labor pool system. The idea that if you're a farmer one day, a baker the next, and an industrialist the third, that's just your lot in life. And you may like one of those jobs and request to go back to it, but unless you earn some more merit in the chaotic system, which again we went over with the hierarchies last video, it's going to be a little tough for you to do that. And finally, capital. In general, capital consists of two things. Or three things, I would say. Capital includes raw resources: metal, iron, gold, money. It also includes raw foodstuffs, meat, algae, various types of plant matter, sugar, chemicals, etc. that are needed to keep the people alive. The third type is military supplies and manpower, which could arguably be the same thing. These need to be balanced. If you were to say that a chaotic population had a 3-slider system, that would be it. Military goods, raw resources, and food, and population if you wanted to add that. There's a very important concept here that I'd like to mark out, and it's just something that really bothers me when people describe chaotic worlds. It is super important to remember that we are still working within the bounds of 40k here. Now, for all the chaotic stuff and all the maximalization and the industrialization, chaos has limitations. They're not the Adeptus Mechanicus. They won't always have the luxury of having even a tech adept, much less a tech priest, to help organize and streamline technology. That means that they have to cleave to a very, very important working concept. Many hands make light work. What would have taken an adept and a couple of servitors in a regular hive is going to take about 50 guys who have spent their entire life, or at least the last 8 months, trying to figure out how to change a light bulb. Now, that may sound horribly inefficient and horrible for the people, right? If 50 people have to take their time to change a light bulb, that sounds like a waste. Remember, the population is starving for work. They need to work to live. That means everyone. Women, children, the elderly, people who wouldn't have been doing heavy industrial jobs under the Imperium, if they want to eat, they need to work. Or they need to know somebody who has access to more food. Now, there are people in chaotic society who have access to more food. Soldiers, cultists, acolytes, leaders, etc. Apart from the whole many hands make light work, the idea that 30 or 40 chaos cultists might be doing what 1 or 2 Imperials were doing, and of course that applies to every factory. Think of a single step in an assembly line, doubling or tripling or quadrupling the number of people on that line to marginally increase efficiency, while also giving people a reason to be fed. But think about that in the context of something like sanitation. Think about it in the context of something like housing, in the context of something like entertaining. Because, of course, chaos needs entertaining. The cultists and the warriors and the soldiers need people to be around. They need comfort and entertainment and fun. Those people are going to be numerous. And because these soldiers and warriors will have better and more access to food, equipment, goods, supplies, places to sleep, etc., Well, that's going to be a booming industry of people making their daily bread by making the Chaos Worshippers happy. And usually, that means growing a lot closer to them as well, which is another way that Chaos cultists can infect more of society by their mere presence. That includes with Chaos corruption, or just physically. Next, we get to the 3 types of industry. You have industry. This is cottage industry. This is a blacksmith or a small shop or a single house-sized factory that produces one very specific thing. It's not incorporated, it's not massively diversified, it cannot change quickly, it is relatively static, and it uses static inputs and static outputs with inefficient techniques, inefficient tools, etc. These are things that you're going to find on a civilized world. These are things that Chaos can improvise on traditional worlds, on all different types of demon worlds, and of course on traditional Chaos worlds and feral worlds, feudal worlds, etc., etc., etc. Industry, quote-unquote, is the next step up. Industry, quote-unquote, basically refers to imperial industry. This is where we haven't quite gotten to gigantification yet, but we're copying the Imperials, right? We're taking things like car factories or designs for them, and we are putting them back into practice. Now, does that mean that we need to keep a leather factory and an oil and grease factory? Do we need to keep all of them running in order to make our armored cars? No, absolutely not. These are supposed to be unergonomic weapons of war. We don't need all the fancy bells and whistles of true imperial industry. We're just cannibalizing what we do need and then turning it to our own needs. And the final one is macro industry, or what I often refer to as line industry. This is what most of the population is when most of the population is involved with production. So on an agri-world, the industry is an entire planet geared towards making one type of food. Or on a hive world, this is every single hive geared towards making guns, or artillery, or body armor, or tanks. Now, this means everything that gets gutted, everything that gets cleared, all the ancillary systems like power, waste, sewage, water, supply, etc., all of them are maintained, to a greater or lesser degree, by the civilian population, and the entirety of the industry is overhauled for true, full-on military production. A good example of this, actually, is Hive Tertium from Darktide. You have a planet that is still technically functional, and a hive that is technically functional, that a cult owns most of, and they are spending a large portion of their time producing things for themselves, for the war effort, essentially. It is full wartime production. Now, is that needed on every single world that Chaos owns? Absolutely not. Quote-unquote industry that kind of ignores the frilly stuff and the support and logistics, that works in the short term, and heck, it can work in the long term if you don't worry about devolving back to a lower level of technology, which a lot of these places really don't. Again, see civilized worlds that stay civilized worlds, but then you'll have a world like Gura that really wants to move up in the world, and so they steal a bunch of resources from other planets, raid a bunch of things, and create a proto-hive with orbital defenses and with massive iron-walled fortresses and things of that nature. Industry with a capital can also be referring to using demons in production and using warp energy a la Demon Forge worlds and other demon worlds in the warp. So in what form can Chaos provide all these things? How could they be made? What forms do they come in? Well, the first one is physical primitive resources. Physical primitive resources are your basic foods, your undigested meats, your grok steaks, your burgers, your iron ore, your gold ore, your sets of copper rings, all that types of stuff. Basic things that anyone who has a pickaxe and a lot of brawny strength, or a lot of friends with pickaxes and brawny strengths, could get. Physical resources, on the other hand, are what comes from that. We also refer to these as worked resources. Worked resources are things like steel ingots. They could also be things like cogs, tools, pieces of equipment, very simple machines, etc., etc. Maximalized resources are a final product, a gun, a chainsword, a set of body armor, a rebreather, a drill, a las cannon, a laser gun, etc. all of these maximalized resources have to go through multiple steps of production. For physical primitive resources, you need one-step production, right? You just need to take it out of the ground. You need to take it from the earth of your demon world, the earth of your princehood world, the earth of your traditional world, or the earth of your captured world. Very simple. Physical resources need another set of refinement, right? If you're talking about fuel, you have raw petroleum, and then you refine it, after taking it out of the ground, into gasoline. If you have hydrogen in the air, first you need to capture it, then you need to refine it and put it into an engine. Now you're talking about 2 steps of production. And maximalized resources will usually have convergent production. That means if I have one 2-line production producing steel, one 2-line production producing electronic components, and another 2-line production producing lasguns, well, now I have the metal, the electronic components, and all I need to do is run them through the last line, and bingo bango, I now have a production line of lasguns. In reality, that's like 7 steps in order to get to that point, but all you see is the lasguns spitting out happily on the line to go be used in the name of the Dark Gods. So, maximalized resources are about as good as you're ever gonna get. It's a full, finished copy of an imperial something or other. Now, you could argue that there's weapons that could be made at the physical resource tier, you know, an axe, a club, all that type of stuff, but maximalized resources, those are really what you want. Unnatural resources are the final one. This is where chaos has begun to taint our industry. The idea that our chainswords are particularly spiky or nasty. The idea that, well, I didn't design that tank that way, but it started to grow a mind of its own, or develop some skin or hair, or have something else just kind of off with it. Might have been during production, might have been after production, but whatever chaos corruption that we've unintentionally, or in some cases intentionally introduced to the process, has improved it, or at least changed it in some way. So let's quickly look at some problems with Chaos Worlds. First off, transition state problems. We already know about these, right? Change for these worlds is always rough. In the warp, you need to adapt, and in real space, you need to have the Imperials organize, which arguably in and of itself is even harder. All this conquering and changing extends your timeline for how long you have to wait to really improve your society, to increase the amount of resources you have access to, and to really improve your outlook of being successful at whatever it is you're trying to do. Infighting. This is essentially the point at where might makes right meets logic. Hey, most people understand that might makes right basically results in everyone beating each other to death. However, if you use might makes right to actually gain control of your cult, Khorne comes into mind here, Chaos Undivided comes into mind here, lots of traditional cults do it that way. If you're going to have might makes right as your primary reason to upwell and to uprise against your planet, rather than some ideological or religious bent, which, you know, that's the other option, and it doesn't rule out might makes right being part of your philosophy. But it does also kind of mean that if you're a priest and somebody comes at you with the, I have bigger biceps than you should probably be able to use your religious flock to have that guy beaten to death. At that point, you're no longer talking about might makes right, you're talking about the coercive power of the state, in this case the theocratic state, being able to remove even powerful threats to its power. Might makes right versus logic is what happens when this cycle of violence catches up with you. The idea that, oh, I took over my planet by force, and so someone is trying to oust me by force, who is even from within my own cult. Well, you have 2 options. You can either try and put them down quickly and hard, or if you're more intelligent and more reasonable, which at this point plenty of cults are able to be, some will not be, you are simply going to be able to talk them into having a possibly better option. Nobody really just uprises for no reason. Plenty of people are avaricious, greedy, ambitious, etc., whatever it needs to be in order for them to choose to go against the status quo. Some people are just malcontents, and that's perfectly fine. Removing malcontents should probably be a primary goal of an early cult, but even if it isn't, it doesn't mean that everybody throws logic out the window. If a feral warlord decides that he wants to take on the organized, civilized world of chaos worshippers, hey, we aren't in Norska anymore. We're not going to pretend like the Southerners are any softer just because they worship gods with different names. If I've been on a civilized world for 20 years, and you decide you want to take your feral band of hardboys against my reorganized PDF, enjoy getting shot to death, dickhead. So that's oftentimes how it ends up being. Someone thinks they're big and tough. The person who's more organized, much like agriculturalists in the modern day, has more bodies, more equipment, more technology to throw at them, murder them, and move on. Pressures, internal and external. The Imperium is coming. The Imperium is coming to kill us all. The Taxman cometh. They're here to try and take our shit. If they didn't know that we were chaos already, they're probably figuring it out now. The gods require their due. Something, etc. is causing us to need something. We need something. We need food. We need weapons. We need equipment. We need orbital defenses. We need ships. We need manpower. We need demons. We need marines. All different types of things a society may need if there are external concerns. Now, the internal concerns, things like infighting, things like transition problems and control problems, those can be a problem as well, and we refer to those as internal pressures as opposed to external pressures from the Imperium, from the gods, etc. Now, we've already talked about the idea that the chaos consumes theory, the idea that all chaotic society is inherently negative or inherently consumptive or wasteful is wrong. But all of these things still push you towards maximizing your time and resources. At the very minimum, it means you can't fuck around. Now, on a demon world or a princehood world, you have more time, but more time isn't infinite time. You're eventually going to need to serve a purpose, because that's why you're there. So again, if you're idle, and if you don't do anything, you're probably gonna die. So a lot of people falling into idleness, or even just falling into something as simple as depression, or convalescence, or illness, can really ruin life for you, because, well, time's a-moving, pressure's a-coming, and if you can't deal, you're probably gonna get steamrolled. Finally, timelines and bottlenecks. For all of the above, this applies. You're still retro-technological. You still have to rely, as heavily as possible, on many hands make light work. If you have a tank that would normally be put together by massive machines, but the machines got damaged or destroyed in the uprising, well, now you're going to have to put it together by hand. And that's going to take about 1,000 times as many people, and maybe 10 times as long as it would normally have taken. Even if you have a place taken over with most of its infrastructure intact, you need to learn how to use it. And if you use it wrong, you need to learn how to repair it. And that takes time, experimentation, manpower, etc., that you might straight up not have because of the internal and external pressures. If you need to show results right now, it's a lot better to have 1,000 people working on a problem very slowly than to have 10 people standing around scratching their heads looking at a machine and going, "Damn, I wish I knew how to read." So let's talk about some good examples here of Chaos Worlds. Avesta the Proud. Now I have made all of these up, so these are just coming out of my head initially. Avesta the Proud. This is going to be going down logistical samples of planets, basic production, etc., from most to least complicated. This is a Nurgle captured agri-world is Avesta the Proud. Their production line is essentially food. They have 2 steps. One, there's ritual corruption of the land. They intentionally open up warp rifts that let out demons and creatures, but more importantly, let out corruption directly onto the planet itself, creating centralized dead zones, like, essentially like aquaculture or like Chinampas. You have an area that is, stewing in chaos corruption, and then there's a certain band around it where they found and experimented with something called black wheat. Now, what is black wheat? It is ritual corruption plus the normal wheat that was being made on Avesta the Proud in the first place. The product of this is black wheat. What is black wheat? Well, it is essentially large, pustule-like, heavy-headed wheat seeds. Now, to the Imperials, this tastes kind of gross, and it isn't really all that great. But it produces about 10 times as many calories as a regular head of wheat would. These little kernels are 4-5 times the size of a normal one, and they have a higher calorie content. Great. This may have taken a little bit of experimentation, and of course the chaos corruption is never 100% predictable and safe, but once it's done, it can be maximalized. If you've done it once, you can do it again. Such is the nature of chaos that once you get the system down, you can game it pretty reliably with only a few unnecessary or unintended consequences. The result of this production line is the mass processing and production of the black bread. Black bread, what is that? Well, for everyone in the local system, black bread is the food that everybody eats. It's the food that feeds the entire planet of Ovesta, and it's the food and the food makers who get sent out with other forces that are supplied by Ovesta. Now, their export in that case, or the meals they serve, are cooks. They bring people from Ovesta who know how to deal with the black wheat, know how to store it, know how to make it into different types of food, know how to bake it into the black bread, etc., and they ship them out. In addition, for a planet that's going to have this high of a population and this low intensity of a crop, just wheat essentially, they're going to have plenty of extra laborers, plenty of population to go off-world and be soldiers or be some other force. They might be serfs for Space Marine warbands, etc. And in this case, I do mean literal contractual serfs. The person agrees to something and, of course, as an agreement with the planet. So a deal might go like this. Chaos Warlord comes down, says, this is a nice pretty world you have right here, I think I'll take it. The population says, no, fuck you, we have orbital defenses, we've been here for a whole hell of a lot of time, and there's plenty of other forces that use this planet, so good luck dealing with them if you try and take it from us. He says, alright, rough, tough, I'm not a huge warband, I can't deal with the entire planet by myself, sure. What are you offering? They're like, we got bread. He's like, I need bread. All right. So if I give you a whole bunch of lasguns to increase the power of your defensive structure, what are you going to give me? They're like, cool. Yeah. Here's a whole shit ton of bread. And in addition to that, do you want like 5 or 6 cooks? And on top of that, hey, if we're giving away people, we've got like 2,000 people who don't have a job right now, so we're going to turn our unemployed people into profit, essentially. And they'll say, sure, here's a dozen more lasguns, we'll take your 2,000 extra guys, they're now serfs. Now, they could negotiate on how exactly they're supposed to be treated, whether they're supposed to be armed or whether they're just to be used as fodder, but that's basically down to the world and how much they care about their own population. Now, at a certain point, especially with worlds that have uprisen from the interior, they're going to care about their local population. Other ones, maybe not nearly as much. And then, of course, they will have the stable, enhanced black bread as an export. An army, for example, of Ovesta the Proud might consist of thousands of melee-armed cultists, many of them mutants, working in the fields with scythes and hoes and sharpened shovels, here to come beat you to death. It's also probably going to consist of a lot of people who are from the industrialized black bread bakeries and mills, who are considerably more militarized because they are benefiting quite handsomely off of the trade of all of this food to other chaotic forces. Now, that could be lasguns, it could be autoguns, it could also be things like, grenades, shotguns, rocket launchers. Plenty of stuff you're going to get that warbands essentially don't want to use or don't want to give to their cultists, and they'd be happy to trade to somebody who can maybe put up a defense. Another important thing is some of these worlds are going to supply forces that are under siege. If they're under siege, they need to defend themselves as well, because who knows when the Imperium is going to show up to Ovesta itself and try and put them under lock and key. The other thing that they will likely have are mercenary marines, or hangers-on forces who are currently doing orbital resupply. Say you have a couple of light cruisers that belong to the Black Legion around Ovesta, and they're just hanging around, they're transferring food and people, and they're jawing it with the local population, hanging out, maybe trying to stalk some demons or have some fun on the world, literally some downtime for the Chaos forces. And then, oh no, an Imperial strike group has shown up. If the Marines value this planet, which they probably will, and also, very importantly, if they've made contracts with this world, and those contracts are binding, which they very much can be. Again, we're talking about Chaos here, where literal magic can be baked into contracts. Haha, baked, because it's a bread world. There's a very good chance that they could be forced into trying to defend the planet and keep this resource going. Even if initially they were just mercenaries or hanger-on troops. On from Ovesta the Proud to Arta Corn, the Fortress of Arms. Now again, I did just come up with these, but take it with a grain of salt, I'm trying to be funny here. Arta Corn, the Fortress of Arms, it is a demon armory world of Corn. Not like a traditional armory, a demon armory. This is inside of the warp, made by Corn's hands. The resources? Very simple. Stored chaotic weaponry. Forged examples of Khorne's demons or his followers that have been brought into this planet, Archon, and provided to his worshippers in order to get them where they're needed. And of course, a planet like this will have plenty of warp energy as well. If you needed energy for ritualism, if you needed power for ritualism, if you needed a place to do your ritual to Khorne, Archon's a solid place to do it, if you can find it. The production line on the planet like this, and the ecosystem around it, is going to be based off of storing and transferring these demonic weapons that Khorne has given us. An item is given into your keeping. Let's say it's a Hellblade or a demonic power sword. Cool. You use your ritualism and the psychic pathways of this realm, again, the hellish MC Escher stairs that we're walking on, to bring that item where it is needed, or store it in your bastion for long-term protection. As a result of this, you are sustained. Every time you reach a tower with your weapon or you store it for a certain period of time, Khorne directly blesses you, or the world itself rewards you. Now, this can literally range from manna from heaven, say, giant loaf of bread drops down from the ceiling, quite literally, I'm not even being facetious, drops down from the ceiling and you get to eat that. It could also be Khorne blesses you, and you no longer feel tired and hungry. That's it. You are just granted strength by Khorne. End of story. So, this is more of a direct process where you're being interfered with because you're acting as Khorne's courier service for his magic items. There's a whole bunch of portals here. They go to certain areas. When somebody summons up a demon weapon or needs something transferred, you are FedEx. You are the FedEx for Khorne. When somebody needs one of these demon blades transferred, or when he needs an item taken from place A to place B, or a particularly dangerous or naughty demon weapon needs to be kept on this world forever, he just teleports that shit to Archon. One of these groups or tribes, for lack of a better term, of worshippers grabs it, picks it up, brings it with their stash, and either brings it where it needs to be, or transfers it to long-term storage, and they are rewarded with a mix of, most likely, eternal life, blessings of Khorne, and no longer needing the basic requirements of being alive. The problems with this are, well, obvious. The infinite stairway concept has a bunch of hardened portals, and these are rife with dangers. The delivery men, again the FedEx workers, are quite violent, and they certainly do hope that their tribe might please Khorne the most, meaning that if they met another tribe of 10 to 100 worshippers on the stairs, they would quite gladly cut each other to pieces with all of the demonic artifacts they've been granted, in the hopes that they will gain more demonic artifacts. So, an army example for something like Archon, say if you were psychotic enough to, I don't know, walk back through one of these Khornate portals, or teleport yourself to this place, or if you were an Imperial who just so happened to try and break into something like an armory world of Khorne, you will be facing hundreds of squad tribes of bloodthirsty and viciously armed demon weapon-wielding psychopaths who have been fighting on this world infinitely, possibly in perpetuity, for hundreds of thousands of years, who have no fear of death and are wielding some of the most deadly and diabolical items in all of unreality. Also, it's quite possible that an external population of servants, devotees, or even demons would also exist on a world like this if there was a more standard ecosystem outside of it that needed to do things like repair the gateways, take care of the stairs, ensure that the worshippers are brought their food, their rewards, the generous gifts for their FedEx service, etc. All of these things would be a staple on a planet like Archon. Carnival. Carnival is a demon prince world, so it's one of those subsumed worlds. It is Yonex's pleasure world. Now, pleasure worlds are not unheard of in the Imperium, they're certainly not unheard of within Slaanesh worlds, but Yonex is a prince. His world is exactly how he wants it to be. So what are the resources on a world like this? Human labor, that's a primary one. Obviously, if we're talking about Slaanesh, the result of regular Slaaneshi worship is going to be more Slaaneshi worshippers, on average. It is also going to be an intense recycling program. Now, why is recycling so important? It's mostly because the fecundity of Nurgle is absent here. So if we're going to need to produce natural resources, well, we're certainly going to need to scrape every single possible little bit of it we possibly can. And in this case, it comes out of the flora and fauna. Now, a production line for this is very, very simple. The goal here is that everybody's having a good time. Good time, again, being a Slaaneshi phrase for being tortured, but also being incredibly out-of-your-mind stimulated in various different ways. The most important person on this world? Yonex. So if anybody contributes to his pleasure, well, you're certainly going to get some of your own. That is generally how Slaanesh works. Again, pleasure being a subjective term here. The production line in that case goes, you have a set of wildflowers, or a great tree, or a large number of natural plants that give in tiny, tiny little infinitesimal chemical amounts refined materials to make narcotics. So a very simple one. The ability to make narcotics. Coca leaves, for example. A population of human serfs, once they're not partying or being actively blessed, they go out, they collect, they refine these narcotics into a drug, they provide it to their great overlord, Yonex. The prince receives their offering of glorious pink Slaaneshi cocaine, and they are gifted in return with food and a good time. Again, you're seeing the theme of, even on a demon world, work for food is the whole point. It is a survival mechanic. The only difference is that on a Slaanesh world, food also comes with one hell of a reward. A genuinely incredible reward that many people will be thirsting after for literal decades into the future. So the cycle therein goes, you have a great time, you had a bunch of food, you're feeling lovely, you've gotten a bunch of people in situations where they're going to produce more children, and then, after a couple of months, you wash out of the production cycle. Damn, all of that high has gone away, I feel miserable, I feel sad, I run right out to the resource fields, I grab more coca leaves, I run back to the factory that refines them, I get more cocaine, I bring it up, I wait in the long line with my sack of cocaine, and then I continue the process, over and over and over again. This is a great after-party, but I digress. What would an army look like for the planet of Carnival? Well, wild Slaaneshi possessed, or humans that have become terraformed to this way of living, would be a primary. You're going to get a lot of these people who are stuck in the cycle of pleasure, work, pleasure, work, pleasure, work. Essentially, the pleasure-pain principle of increasing pleasure, decreasing pain has been brought to its absolute maximum in these people, and as a result, their physical bodies, and possibly even their souls and minds, have changed quite dramatically to accommodate these needs. So that's going to be a primary one. The acolytes, so to speak, are these wild Slaaneshi possessed or crazy people, or straight up demons. It is relatively common for Slaaneshi demons to not be nearly as aggressive towards other worshippers and other cultists because, well, the aggression is channeled towards other means, shall we say, and leave it at that. So having half-possessed, having full-possessed, or just having straight-up demons walking around and cavorting with the humans is not abnormal. This is usually going to be augmented by an honor guard. Essentially, the guardians of the Dark Prince's desires. The classic one, if you want to look at good old-fashioned Sigvald. The guardians of the Dark Prince's desires, the Dark Mirrors, all of these folks who are directly related to the prince. These might be his original cultists, his original acolytes, or perhaps just people who have pleased him or Slaanesh in such a way that they've been granted permanent access to the party. They've been able to escape the horrible drudgery of the constant cycle of pleasure, and now they just get it all the time. They're the entertainment now for others. Now, if this is a true Demon Prince world, and this cycle's been going on for long enough that it's become self-sustaining, that honor guard of mortal acolytes could number in the millions. If it's a planet with a population in the billions, you could easily have 1.5 million acolytes who have truly begun to resemble demons more so than they resemble human beings. We're talking massive half-human, half-animal hybrids, or straight intelligent animals with human heads. We could also be talking things that look more like demonettes than anything else. It would be very hard at a certain point to distinguish the Guardians of the Dark Princess Yonex's desires from a demonette, because that's eventually what they're going towards. So, a little bit harder there, but definitely not too hard to figure out what the ecosystem on Carnival would be. Finally, the most complex, the Cult of Swift Flesh. Now, this is a traditional Tzeentchian Chaos World, one that I think suffers from the most harmful stereotypes as far as Chaos Worlds go. People really hate the idea of Tzeentch being organized, which I dislike, because Tzeentch is supposed to be at least marginally intelligent, and if you are intelligent, you know that you need to be organized in order to get anything done. And the idea that layers of organization automatically work against each other is quite literally the opposite of what all of human history is. If you're going to say that science works against itself, that's just how you see Tzeentchian worship then, which is fine, I'm not going to be against it. But what's available to the Cult of the Swift Flesh? They're on a traditional Tzeentchian world. It's not much. It's a mountainous, cold hellhole. They have some natural metals, sure. They have some hydrocarbons. They don't really know how to use them yet, but they have them. And they have limited quantities of natural chemicals. Sulfur, carbon, lithium, etc. But their population is small and isolated. Unlike the rest, they haven't had a massive population to pull from because it's a traditional world. Our technology is really, really regressed. We don't have a lot of things to actually interact with, and nobody's coming around and giving us lasguns anytime soon. So how do we deal with this? How do we improve? What does our life look like? Well, our production line is a whole hell of a lot longer, but a bunch simpler. It's a pyramid. It's a very simple pyramid. Civilians, terrace farming. Everybody's on the mountaintops. Everybody's organizing the traditional towers or templum in which the chaos rituals are performed. And then on the lower slopes where there's more water, they have mines and they have terrace farms, and they organize for food and resources to be brought up the mountain to the great magi of the Swift Flesh. The cultists secure the lesser tribes. They're organizing and setting up a militant force in order to make sure that all of the other forces on this Tzeentchian Chaos World keep in line, keep paying tithe, or perhaps they even aim to exterminate them. One cult or one subgroup, like the Blood Pact for example, the Swift Flesh cult might have the goal of nobody else. Everybody is Swift Flesh or you are no longer on our planet. So, the goal of them is to become fully dominant. The Acolytes, then, are next up. They are no longer laboring, they're not warriors, they are scholars. They study the way of the gods, they look up to the stars, they use what psychers they have available to try and read the entrails of the chickens and to understand what great knowledge the warp has to hold. And they spend their entire lives whiling away at books and scrolls and histories and all these foretellings and prophecies just to die and hand over their work to the next acolyte in line. And again, this will be a hereditary position at this point. We're now talking about lords and fiefdoms and chieftains and all that types of stuff in charge of our mountain villages and fastnesses. Again, considering our population to be on the upwards of the millions. Then finally you have the dominant demagogue. The goal of this dominant demagogue, this lord who intends to unify his planet and glorify the dark gods, is to summon demons. To specifically summon demons of Tzeentch. Why? Two reasons. One, when you don't have access to high technology, there's only one real way to get it in space if you are this limited. If you don't know how to make the fuel work, if you don't know how to make the metals work, if your chemicals are not good for you, if your science and technology hasn't developed very much, which, by the way, no failing of the cult. It could genuinely be the fact that their society is based on the tops of mountains, and the lower parts of the mountains, or hell, any other part of the planet, might be toxic, or volcanic, or freezing cold, or not have any sunlight, for example. At which point, yeah, your society is going to have a hard time developing when it doesn't have any sun. Example, the very northern countries in Europe are a good example where it's dark. But imagine living in Alaska, for example, or in the Arctic, all year round. Your society would have a hard time developing, and it would have very limited areas where it could develop. And as a result of this, the only option you have is to go directly to the gods to ask them for help. The best way to do that? Summon a greater demon of Tzeentch, beg them for the knowledge required in order to improve your society. They will hopefully give it to you, and then you can progress to the next step. So, I do have to say that as much as I frown on or I kind of diss this type of civilization, it is kind of the most important, because it means that eventually this type of society, like all chaos societies, will crystallize as the summoning and the mass of its population increases. More technology, more developed population. More developed population, better ways to do industry and business and production. More demons that can be produced. And as a result of more demons that can be produced, more technology, and once again the cycle continues. In this case, it's not a cycle of degradation and destruction, rather it is a cycle of progress. Certainly one that Tzeentch would be infinitely familiar with. And again, when people talk about, well, somebody's just going to come along, kill that demagogue, and the whole cycle sets over again. Excuse me, did we lose the technology when the first guy died? Did we lose the ability to fire up coal forges when the demagogue is killed? Did we lose the knowledge that all of our workers have on how to make better plants when the demagogue died? Sure, we might lose some ritual knowledge, we might lose some things that only he knew, some plots or plans he had in place, sure, but the greater societal progress that is made by demonic intervention in traditional worlds will never be undone. Because again, that would be as if humanity completely abandoned necessary functional technology. Now, there are some very early examples of people giving up things like agriculture. This was because of abundance, generally, not because of limitation. If you are limited, and you have no reason to start a farm, say Amerindians, for example, and you basically can sustain yourself off hunting and gathering, yeah, that's understandable. But we're assuming a planet has those resources. And if that's the case, there's no need for all of this complicated stuff. If you could live off of hunter-gathering forever, you can go directly into the chaos worship, full-blown. All you need is the knowledge. But most of these worlds, generally because they're traditional worlds, they've been overlooked by the Imperium, either there's something really wrong with them, or they are so far out of the way, so laughably far from anything else in the galaxy, that they need the help in order to contact others. So, an army example, at the time of escaping their world for the Swift Flesh cult, they will have thousands of mutated acolytes. Again, they might maximize the number of mutants in their society. Again, given by the name Swift Flesh, it's likely that the flesh melt mutation is something that they value. Combat psychers, likely either generated or created using psychic powers or possibly even demons. And of course, quick summoning demons or bound demons, helper and attaché demons will be common because that's the first thing you're going to try and summon. You're going to try and summon something that can talk to you and talk you through how to do more complicated rituals. You're not going to start off trying to summon a greater Lord of Change. That's just going to result in you getting obliterated, most likely, for wasting the poor guy's time. But if you start off with a Flamer of Tzeentch, and you ask him, hey man, how do I do this whole summoning thing correctly? Now, he might not give you the right option, but as long as you're taking proper precautions against the demon being a little bastard, there's a pretty good chance you'll be able to summon your way up to something much more decent. And of course, getting the names, getting the process down, getting the repeatable effect of summon demons into combat going, well, quick summoning or bound demons by their name are a very, very good thing for combat psychers to keep around in Chaos. And then in addition to that, likely millions of poorly, aka unarmed, or traditionally armed cultists. All of your guys who before were crumping down all the other non-militarized, non-organized chaos or neutral societies, those cultists who were trying to dominate everybody and unify the planet under the rule of the demagogue, well, now they've become your foot soldiers. They're your basic army. They're going to be sent out with swords and axes and spears and steel plate body armor or rings or scale mail. And they're going to be your primary cultists. And hopefully, for the love of God, you can run them into some PDF troops and have them get some actual guns. But, you know, do your best. That's the best that I can offer you there with those troops. Now, I had a big question last time of what about the minor gods and what about Chaos Undivided? For the minor gods, you are looking at a couple of very special, let's say, variables. On the one hand, minor gods are technically less powerful than the true chaos gods. Now, you can argue with me all you want. It is a fact that they will have less demons, they do have less space in the warp, they do have less worlds. But that does also have a double-sided sword, right? Lesser gods have so much more need for the worlds that they do have, and for the cults that they have. They will find more value in, and make more use of, the people who actually choose them. Think of it like a minor soda brand. If instead of drinking Barks root beer, you chose to get Birch beer for today. Well, the person who makes Birch beer and sells maybe a quarter of the bottles that the root beer company does, they're going to be quite appreciative of it, and they might want you to come back as a repeat customer. Thus, they're probably going to price their thing a little bit lower. Thus it is with your minor gods. They're going to reward acts of service more generously, granted with the limited powers that they have, but more generously and more easily. The number of people that a minor god needs to focus on, and the number of demons that they have to focus on those various people, is far lower than it is with one of the major gods. So you're going to get more responses. They're going to be a little bit weaker, but they're essentially going to be easier to get because, well, when you kill one person in the name of Khorne, who cares? He probably got 1 million emails in the last second about people who were killed for him. When you kill somebody for the Dark King, that might be the only one he got today. Same thing for Malal, same thing for whatever other minor chaos god you believe in. This does not apply with proxy gods, by the way. If you are worshipping Slanet instead of Slaanesh, Slanet doesn't actually exist. Slaanesh is getting your worship, so Slaanesh is going to be the one judging you, not the god that you made up in your own head as a proxy for Slaanesh. Undivided. Now, people always say, well, undivided is better than either divided or, of course, minor, because focus, right? The gods are all looking at you, right? All four. You get 4 chances of the dice. Here's the problem. The gods don't necessarily get along. And this works for binary cults quite well. I'd like to add, people often look at it as, well, you worship undivided or you worship divided. No. You can worship Slaanesh and Nurgle at the same time. You can worship Khorne and Tzeentch at the same time. You can worship 3 minus 1. You can do everybody but Tzeentch, everybody but Nurgle, everybody but Khorne. It's all allowed. There's nothing technically preventing that type of mentality. The only problem is cooperation and actually achieving a worthwhile goal for that god without pissing off the other one. Remember, as much as the gods can give blessings, they can also give curses. If you are a follower of one god, it's very easy. There's one diktat that you need to follow. You follow that diktat, you receive blessings from said god. Now, you may be one of a billion followers, or a trillion followers for that matter, but there's still only one master you have to please. 4 masters, 2 masters, 3 masters that all have opposing concepts. Think of it as if you're trying to build a house. You have the homeowner, the contractor, your boss, and then somebody who's financing the whole thing. They all show up at the house, and they're starting to tell you how to do your job. Not a single one of those people is actually going to cooperate with you, nor do they give a shit what your opinion is on how the job should be done. So it actually gets harder to worship correctly as undivided than easier. And again, kind of points to the fact that minor gods might be the way to go if you want the bang for your buck out of chaos quick. You're willing to do horrible shit to get good rewards? Start worshiping Malal and start doing just objectively the most heinous evil shit possible, because you're going to get rewards quickly. They're not going to be as powerful as ones from Khorne, they're not going to be as great as ones from Slaanesh, but they'll be there. Quick, fast, and in a hurry, because, my god, that's the only sippy he's gotten in probably a decade at this point. So, very important. Let's go on to something a little fun here, then. How to design, and I'm sorry for anyone who wanted more information on that or specific things for your gods. I think you can see what I'm going for when you break down this thing, and when I go into how to make a chaos world, you can create one for yourselves. I'd actually encourage you, use this method I'm about to unveil, create a chaos world of your own in the comments. Please do that. How to design a chaos world for fun? Well, consider the resources. What do you have on your planet? What's available? Then population. How many people? What are we available? Are we in the low end? We have the, lower side of millions. Are we on the upper side of millions to low billions in the medium? Or are we in the multiple billions when we get to the high level of population? From there, consider the goal. What type of world are we on? Is it a true demon world? Is this a subsumed world? Was there an accident that shoved your world into the warp and now your people are trying to perform a great ritual to get out of here, to re-enter real space with all of their mutations and their horribleness? Do they have to escape the warp, or are they refugees fleeing from one planet as a chaos cult to try and establish a new homeworld on a new captured world? Is this their eternal homeworld? They've always lived here. This is their traditional chaos world and they cling to their traditions. They're hard on it. They have beliefs that are unorthodox or hyper-specific to their type of living society. And then move on from there. Tie it into your social, societal, historical, and external norms. What is the mindset of a chaos worshiper on your world? One of the primary, in my opinion, one of the primary reasons for infighting amongst chaos isn't that they're simply fractious or dangerous or violent or sociopathic. It's the minor differences in doctrine that set aside people from one another. We all know that good things are good things for the most part, and that applies to all humans, but put one small religious difference between your average person, and it could put a pretty severe damper on any relationship because, well, that's eternity. That's constancy. That's your life, essentially, your soul, that somebody else is either invalidating or possibly, if you care about them, making a problem with their own soul, their own future. It's one of the reasons why conversion is so important to some chaos cults, especially to the Blood Pact. The idea that the mistaken faith, the worship of the Emperor, is unnatural to mankind, and that you're endangering your soul and your natural purpose by committing to this false belief, essentially. Or limiting yourself to this false belief. So, a good example of this, just right off the top of my head. Ruteria, a demonic agri world. This is a world in the warp, demonic world, agri world. Humans, they self-cultivate growing auto-brewery syndrome beer within their bodies to be sold by the billions of gallons to outsiders. So everybody on this world essentially eats a bunch of really basic materials like heavy cellulose grass and other things. They graze like cows on their bellies and they have big distended stomachs. And each of them has like a spigot or something shoved into their side every couple of years, and they let out beer because they all have auto-brewery syndrome from being on this planet, which is perfect for brewing beer for centuries, and their society is developed in such a way that the biggest gut and the most powerful constitution and also the stumpiest and most powerful limbs, that's what indicates the most fervent worshiper of the gods. And, you know, even though this is a silly example, you can kind of see how a society like that would develop. You're on a world that has this specific set of scenarios. There's sugar and wheat and hops and rye and all these things that cause your body to essentially go into a fermentation process inside of your own stomach. The first couple of generations aren't really going to survive this. It's not easy to live on. But after 50, 60, 100 years, somebody's eventually going to develop auto-brewery syndrome. That person is going to be considered blessed by the gods. They're constantly wasted and drunk. They're happy all the time. Look at Timmy. He's laughing his ass off over there, continually eating the grass. What a crazy guy. Let's follow him. He seems like he has a head on his shoulders. Everybody else is miserable and vomiting and having a hard time out there. Jimmy is just having a great time. Maybe we should listen to what Jimmy has to say. So Jimmy has like 30 or 40 kids over his lifetime, and all of those kids develop the same exact special mutation as Timmy. What do you know? All of a sudden you have a society of auto-brewery syndrome creatures that are producing beer in their stomachs for Slaneshi armies all over the galaxy. A wonderful concept, and one that I'd love to hear you guys expand upon with your own worlds down below. So, please note, this is a pretty theory-heavy video as usual, and of course as a part 2 to our previous video on Arch, which is now available to everyone, and I'd recommend taking a look at if you wanted to see more stuff similar to this video. We have a bunch of people to give credit to, of course. GW, Damir Snadgir, McLean Rouston, David Nash, Theocrata, Matt Bradbury, Inkari, Jake Murray, Tony Ackland, Adrian Smith, Igor Ivanov, Sam Manley, Harry Osborne, Moritz Bludow, love Moritz, great artist, Gutierrez, and Alex Kuhn. Now, I hope that you enjoyed. We have 2 upcoming short videos, or 1 combo video on the best possible armament for dreadnoughts and similar dread-esque vehicles, and for knights. So similar to the way that we did for marines, we'll be doing the same thing for knights and dreads, either in 1 video or in 2 videos. Either way, I'll be keeping myself consistent, about 4 days, hopefully, between uploads. I do have to apologize for the failed stream I had a little while ago. Unfortunately, I wish I could do some movie stuff with you guys, but YouTube really didn't like that. Killed the stream like twice and sent me a bunch of angry emails. So worry not about that. It's not a problem. Me and YouTube probably will never get along, but I will do my best anyway. For all that, I hope that you enjoyed, and I wish you all a lovely good night.